Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed.
I am Matilda Tatje, and she had three names actually. Her name was Matilda Tatje, Matilda Judge, and Matilda Clinchy, and we don't know which, but she is buried here as Matilda Tatje, T-A-T-J-E. She was the laundress here at Fort Missoula. She came out, I'm not sure when she came out here. We don't have a lot of information on her, but we know that she was the laundress here, and she died in 1879. And she's buried here. She was the first woman to be buried in this cemetery, which is quite notable. She also was the fourth person to be buried in this cemetery. But I can tell you about her life as a laundress, as an Army laundress. Army laundresses were part of the military. They were attached to the military. They were the only female that was attached to the military, in fact, to the Army. And from that started in 1802, and they continued until 1883. They were assigned 15, there were usually 4 laundresses to a company, and there were between 60 and 80 people in a company, men in a company, soldiers. And so she would have been doing laundry for between 15 and 20 people, and she was paid on a monthly basis. The Army laundress got rations as being attached to the military. She would get rations. She would get probably one ration of meat, 1 ration of bread, and 1 ration of whiskey.
Maple syrup.
Because, you know, she would be back here boiling the water, scrubbing the clothes, wringing out these clothes, hanging them up. First they boiled them. First they soaked them for a couple of days, then they boiled them, then they scrubbed them, and then they had to rinse them, and then they hung them out again, or hung them out to dry. But it was very hard on the muscles, very hard on their skin. As you can see, they had red lines up to their elbows from the abrasion in the water, the scrubbing, and constantly having their hands in water. Usually their hands were quite chapped, as well as being red. They were paid usually 50 cents. It varied from camp to camp where they were. They were paid usually 50 cents per month per soldier, per soldier. The commissioned officers, they were paid $1 to $2 a month, or $4 a month, depending on where they were stationed, and then they earned extra money if they did their husbands or their officers' wives and children. So they made pretty good money. The typical soldier made his average wage was $10, $11, $12, something like that. A good laundress, if she had a good crew to work that she was washing clothes for, she could make up to $40 a month, which was a lot more than what her officer husband made at that time. So she had pretty good wages. Most of the women that came out, they were called camp followers. And an officer might marry one of these women, or a non-commissioned officer might marry one of these women, but they couldn't marry unless they had permission from the higher-ups at the camp. And usually they weren't allowed to marry unless they were going to marry somebody who could become a laundress. So there was kind of a catch-22 there for the wife, but they worked, usually in the summertime they washed the clothes 3 times a week. In the wintertime they washed them twice a week. And I'll tell you, some of these women, most of them were pretty decent women. Whoops, I lost my bottle. Don't want to lose that. But most of them could earn extra money by doing mending or altering or baking things, baking goods for the enlisted men or the officers. A lot of them that came out here when they first came from the States after the war between the North and the South. They came quite often just to get away from what they had lived through. A lot of them were Irish women. That's where we get the Irish washerwoman song. They had tents. Quite often they lived in tents down by the river, the creek, whatever. And they were assigned one tent for 4 laundresses. They had, I think it was one hatchet, 2 pots and pans for the 4 laundresses, and they lived in these tents year-round doing this laundry. Some of the things that they talked about, they saw was the ticks and the fleas and the lice coming out of the men's clothing. So they would just, they were really, some of them said, okay, over here we had, if you're all familiar with this place here at Missoula, over here just right off post, we had Billy Boyle had the 4 Mile House. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. And on Saturday nights, those men would come back, and some of the things that came out of their laundry after that, I don't even want to go there. We'll leave that up to your imagination. Some of the tools of the trade. This is an authentic tub from the Civil War. It's cast iron. It is authentic from the Civil War. This, I believe, came from Fort Shaw, and it's from the front of a stove. All of these came from stoves. This iron, I'm going to let some of you ladies carry this. Just lift this and see how much fun that would be.
I can't believe it.
Isn't that heavy? Yes. And then after this came the irons with the detachable handles. And then after that, we also had this type that as you can see, I did my ironing today. It's all folded up here nice.
Wash cottons, or they didn't boil wool, did they?
No, they didn't boil wool because it would shrink so bad. But a lot of their clothes were not made of wool. Their dress uniforms were the only things that were wool.
Okay.
Because the wool shrunk so badly, but most of it was cotton, right? But they always had to grip it with something like that. They usually had 2 or 3 of these at a time on the stove just to handle it back and forth, I'm going to tell you about this soap. This soap was Procter & Gamble, and we all thought that was fairly new, right? Okay, Matilda died in 1879. In 1878, Procter & Gamble came out with this soap. Prior to that, the laundresses had to make their own soap, or prior to commercial soap, the laundresses had to make their own soap. And they had to boil, they would use wood ash. They had what they called a hopper. They would put sawdust in there and wood ash and let water strain through it, and then they would get the lye out of that. And then they would make their own soap, which was quite a lengthy process. Excuse me. Excuse. But this soap, P&G white soap, was made in 1878. Now over here, I have a picture of a camp laundress. By the way, this is the laundress quarters here at Fort Missoula, very early quarters. This camp laundress, as you can see, has ivory soap down here. That soap, P&G's white soap, was made in 1878. 1879, ivory soap, as we know it, was made in 1879, and it was a mistake of the white soap. They went to lunch one day, the workmen went to lunch, came back, and it had been mixing and mixing and mixing, and here it had all this air in it, and it floated, and they thought, or they didn't want to throw it away, so they sold it. Well, everybody loved it because it floated, and as you can imagine, if you're bathing in the creek or the river, and the soap floats away, this was a miracle, or even in a wash tub, you see. So
they stopped housing them in tents by the river and giving them an actual building.
Here in Missoula, this was the original building, I believe.
Well, then they weren't in the tents.
I don't believe they were until Fort Missoula was established in 1877. And I think this building was up by 1878 or early 1879, as far as I've been told. So they may have had to live in the tent for that period of time, up until that time that this was built. But I don't think it was very long here in Missoula. However, back east, some of these, in some of the other forts, they had one fort, and I don't remember the name of it, they had a barracks that was 144 feet long, 35 feet wide, and it housed 12 laundresses and their families. And their laundry facilities. So as you can see, they didn't have very good living conditions. The laundress was usually the lowest person in society on a fort. She earned good money, better money than some of the soldiers, and she got paid before the soldiers did. Her pay was, and her pay was set by the Council of Administration at each post. The paymaster, he took the laundress's money or pay due them out of the paycheck before the soldier got their pay to guarantee that the laundress got her pay. The laundress could wear her dress 3 inches above the ground. An officer's wife could not. An officer's wife was considered a camp follower. She had no status as far as being associated with the Army. She was a camp follower just like the other gals, women that came and followed the camp. So were the children. They were all camp followers.
That term camp follower has other connotations.
Yes, it did.
Because there was more money to be made on Front Street at the same time.
Yes, but we're not going to go on Front Street because we didn't have to, because we had Billy Boyle and the 4 Mile House right off post here.
Well, was it derogatory? You'd think, but that sounds really derogatory, that term for an officer's wife and children kind of being put in that same category. It seems strange.
They were not paid by the Army.
Yeah.
And in fact, laundress position was abolished in the Army in 1883. And I think it was later on, maybe into the early 1900s, I'm not sure, I haven't done a lot of research on that, when the officers' wives really had a status. And they did have a status in early frontier life. They did. But they weren't recognized as being part of the Army or a dependent of the Army even. They didn't, the military did not pay the soldiers more for their dependents. One of the reasons that the Army laundress could wear her skirt shorter is because if they didn't have a stove and had to cook over a campfire, a lot of their dresses caught fire and several were killed because they burned to death. Yeah, wouldn't that be terrible? Well, I mean, it goes to figure, right? So, does anyone have any questions?
So they were allowed to have families and children, and they would live with them in the same quarters?
If they were married and there were facilities available, they could live with them, but other than that, they had to live off post. Quite often, the laundresses would live, as I said before, they called it tent row or suds row, they would live 200 or 200 yards or so downriver or whatever from the regular military post. Yeah. But
I'm guessing there was no maternity leave or something.
no, but they did get the services of a doctor, the post doctor. The women did, the laundress did. So, and they moved with their regiment, they moved with their company. They got to ride on the wagons. The women and their children got to ride on the wagons. The only time they didn't is if the soldiers were off fighting a campaign, and then they were brought up later. So,
Sounds like if a young woman wasn't afraid of hard work and was ambitious, she could really make a lot of money, comparatively, and then for banking it for other purposes.
and most of them did not have an education. They couldn't read or write, and they left it up to the post paymaster or the post settler to determine how much they were paid. But most of them could not read or write. They signed their name with an X, with the mark X, right? And so it was a good money source for a lot of women that came here. And coming from the States right after the war was over, it was a really good way to make a living for us. An honest way. That's right. That's right.
Women serve as nurses on the fort grounds?
Here at Fort Missoula?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't answer that question because I haven't researched that.
Because that would have been another occupation for a female, but it would require more education.
They did serve as midwives, and they got paid for serving as midwives.
The laundresses?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of course, in those days you didn't need a certificate either.
Right, and childbirth was very natural. I mean, we didn't have to go to the hospital to have our children, and etc. Didn't. But the mortality rate for for babies and parents was very, very high, right? And you're gonna, as you go back here, you're gonna see that we have a great deal of great number of children buried back here, right? So.
My name is Private Ole Beck. I was born in Sweden in 1888, and I immigrated with my mother, my father, my sister to Missoula, Montana sometime between the years of 1888 and my draft into the military in 1917. I have reason to believe that I came to the United States in 1903, but I can't prove this. I think I was 15 years of age. Like most young men of my age group, that was the advent of the automobile, and I had a terrific interest in automobiles and mechanical contrivances of the gasoline engine. And so when I registered for the draft and was taken into the military in 1917, I was assigned to the Signal Corps, U.S. Army Aviation Branch of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. I then was trained as a mechanic. I went from Camp Hancock, New Jersey, where I took my training. I then went to Camp Murat in the fall of 1917. I then went to the port of Hoboken, New Jersey, and I disembarked the United States on a troop ship for France. I arrived overseas, and I almost immediately, before being assigned to my unit, I died of diphtheria. I was not the first soldier to die from Missoula. I was the second one. There was another soldier whose name was Guy Lovell of Ronan, who also lived in between Polson and Missoula much of his life. My parents also lived between Polson and Missoula. We lived in both communities, but we were both known as Missoula soldiers. He was the first one to die, but unlike him, for some reason, I must have had a lot of friends and influence in my community, because shortly after World War I, when the veterans of World War I returned to the community and they created the Veterans of Foreign War Post number 209, they honored me by naming the VFW post the Ole Beck Post. And so unlike most World War I soldiers in my community, my name has stayed alive with all the soldiers of foreign wars because the post is named after me. When my funeral, the first soldier, Guy Lovell, was buried in France as the second soldier to die from this Missoula County. My mother and sister requested that my remains be brought back to the United States. I was embalmed, shipped back to the United States. It took 1 month for me to arrive here. When I arrived here for my funeral, of course, my dad had preceded me in death, so I only had my mother and my sister and my friends at my funeral. The Swedish Lutheran Church was in charge of my funeral, along with the post commander of Fort Missoula. And they fired a 21-gun salute over me and blew the tops and put me to rest. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my unit. I was in the 2nd Motor Maintenance Regiment. And if I would have continued to have lived in France, I was in a very unique regiment. The United States Army found out when it arrived overseas that they had trained me as an aviation mechanic, but they didn't have enough airplanes for me, for my unit to work on. So my outfit, the 2nd Motor Maintenance Regiment of the U.S. Army Signal Corps Aviation Section, got reassigned to the French Army at Boron, France, as tank mechanics. And unlike nearly all other soldiers of the Great War, I had the unique privilege, my unit wound up wearing a Signal Corps aviation brass on their collar of their uniform. It's got a wing and prop, and on my sleeve I wore an aviation patch with the wings with a prop in it. When our unit was assigned by the U.S. Army to the French Army for tank mechanics, because we had now acquired nearly 1,000 French FT-17 tanks to use in our army, I was then allowed to wear a French Tank Corps patch on my sleeve, and I got to wear a Tank Corps badge with a tank with a wyvern dragons and everything that they could breathe fire. That was their historical outfit about the dragon was breathing fire. I got to wear that on my cap. Interestingly, one of the soldiers that served in my outfit, I'm sorry I can't remember his name today, but he at the VFW post in Stevensville, Montana, is named after a guy that was in my same outfit, and I, a number of years ago, was fortunate enough from his son to obtain his uniform and helmet, and it has a signal insignia like this painted on the side of the helmet. It has this FT-17 tank painted, and the uniform has both things on it. So I know for a fact this is the way this insignia was worn on this coat. Today in the collector's market, these uniforms, once in a great rarity, will surface. Many neophyte collectors will sit and discount them. They think they're faked up and people have added a bunch of insignia to them. But in fact, this is the way our uniform was. We're really kind of a unique group of boys within the military. All military guys vie to have insignia, and my outfit was one that got to wear 2 branches of the Army's insignia on their uniform. So that's a historical background of my outfit. And that was the end of my career in the military. So if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to ask anything you can ask of me.
I missed the start of it. He died in France.
I died of diphtheria.
Diphtheria.
Right, yeah. I took my training. I went in the military right after the war. I registered for the draft. By the fall of 1917, I was in the military. I went to Camp Hancock, Georgia. Since I was 29 years old at the time, and my interest was mechanic stuff. I was a young boy of that era that loved mechanicals and automobiles. I guess the young guys still to this day do. And I had a great aptitude for mechanical things, and so I was assigned to the mechanical section of the aviation branch as a aviation engine mechanic, motor maintenance regiment. But when I arrived in France, they didn't have enough airplanes for our unit to work on, and so we were reassigned to the French Army's tank depot at Boron, France, B-O-U-R-N-N-E, as FT-17 tank mechanics. And so while I'm a signal corps guy and I'm working on aviation, my rifle here, all soldiers have to go through their basic skill with a rifle and learn about the basic combat functions as soldiers. So if they have to serve as soldiers, they have a weapon. This is a 1903 Springfield. But my forte in the military was a mechanic, and there's my big wrench to show you that's what I carried around all the time.
I'm representing in the uniform. Okay, this would have been the uniform for dress parade costumery for the post non-commissioned officer ordnance sergeant. And that's what our Alexander Pillow was. He was an Afro-American, to whatever degree we're not sure, as I've indicated. But he joined, first we have to talk about his date of birth. He recorded in his first enlistment papers of 1849. Later on, when he's established, and he's no longer putting down prior occupation farmer, it's soldier, 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 soldier. He then put down 54 and later 56. I think what he was doing was trying to get in the Army at a very young age. A lot of young men did that. So Alexander Pillow, born in Tennessee, to named parents. It wasn't just a first name, last name. And as you know, you can see the absolute annihilation of persona when you just have a first name. Lois, Rastus, Tatum. No, last name gives us legal authority for our persons to own property, to pass on property and whatnot. Well, his parents had both first and last names, so that was a good sign, but we don't know for sure. But he joined the Army in 1870, and he joined one of the 4 regiments that were available to Afro-Americans. Congress, at the end of the Civil War, had realized that Afro-Americans would fight in a very distinguished manner. They weren't just a yes sir boss, I'll step to the side of the walk. No, they had something to prove, and they were very willing to do it. And so they authorized 6 regiments of armed forces to aid in since they had stopped preventing North and South from blowing apart, and we were back to the nation's business of westward movement. It isn't just a compass direction, it's a state of mind. It's even going on here in Montana now. There are people coming in now to places that they passed through 3 or 4 generations before, going someplace else. And when the Bitterroots and the French towns and the missions and the Missoula valleys are filled up, and even Australia and New Zealand doesn't waggle the finger, something will happen to the American psychology, because we base our optimism on the chance to go someplace else and to get a fresh deal of cards and to start again. When it's any place looks like any place else, something will happen to our national psyche. Well, Pillow, of course, wasn't faced with that. His first regiment was with the 25th Infantry, and you should know this too. The regiments of infantry, we had 25. We always have the cavalry after the... There were 25 regiments of foot, 10 regiments of cavalry. They're just a cultural and Hollywoodized bias that the yellow of the cavalry, that was the service. No, Native Americans had greater fear of footmen because they had a rifle that could fire and accurately to 500, and with a good marksman, 1,000 yards. Whereas the carbine that the cavalry had to carry was only a 250 to 400 yard, 300 at best, range. The Native Americans, whenever they saw the Waka heaps, they'd have a little bit more of a dead space between them and the military. So Pillow was placed with the 25th Infantry, and of course, with the style, with the subjectivity of the time, the Afro-Americans were sent into Texas. They also sent into the Dakotas. They were not sent to the more settled western Pacific coast. They were sent to the great American desert. So Pillow was there with Company G, if you'd like a seat, these are original mess hall stools, by the way. That one came from Fort David Allen Russell in Wyoming. I got that as a young man when I was down there in my younger days. This came from Fort Missoula. I found it at some guy sitting on it at an antique show. Somebody had used it as a terrible workbench for a saw, But with the replacement of the rungs and what I'll have to do to the top here, it's back to having a masculine gluteal maximus in it. How many know what the knob is used for? Anybody know?
You told us. Hey.
Some of you. There's new people here, and so yeah, it's for the hat. Yeah. Speaking of which, soldiers were amazed at the stuff they had to wear that came to them from the people in the swivel chairs. There was one article about the first campaign hat that we had that was issued. It was called the Model 1872, and it looked like it was designed by Vincent Price. It had a big floppy brim. It was meant to be folded up so you could carry it in your saddlebags or put it in your blanket bag as a footman, and then when you needed it, you'd take it out. But it was so weak that one fellow, you couldn't write against anything with your name attached to it that the government placed at you. You were to soldier it. Yes, sir, I will go right ahead and do it. So they had a paper, but our army was drawn from a democracy, and we're used to the embryonic idea of individualism and free speech. So soldiers who were never allowed to have a union, for all reasons they're obvious, they had a newspaper that they could express their view on. It was called the Army and Navy Journal. And you as an officer or as an enlisted man, you could send in a letter that was a critique of something that wasn't liable, it wasn't slanderous. But they would often send in with a nom de plume, with a pseudonym. And there was one fellow who wrote in about the Army fatigue campaign ad, said, "There has never been a more uncouth or lousy rag ever placed on our heads by the government than this hat." Well, there were those that didn't like these things either because they were hot, they crushed easily. And when a soldier went into enlistment in your first 5 years, from the Civil War through till about 1892, it was 5 years for enlistment. When you look at those service chevrons, which tell you immediately how long this individual's been in and what branch of service he's been in, 2 in the Ordnance Department, infantry, service in war with infantry, artillery. These meant 5 years. So, there were some people there was one man who was the ordnance sergeant at Fort Laramie. His name was Leopold Schneider. Good German boy. Another product of superior German genetics going into the military. He was the only ordnance sergeant that Fort Laramie ever had, 1849 to 1890. The poor man had his service chevrons going up to where they had to shift above regulation his rank chevrons. Well, see, this is the trouble when you get out in the heat in a blue uniform. That I get off on a rib and I forgot where the spinal column was. Where was I going with that? Well, as long as you're smiling, it doesn't mean a damn thing, does it? What's that? Say that again?
In Wyoming?
Oh, no, that doesn't ring a bell. You weren't paying attention. We had a love-hate thing for the French, the way we always have had. Panama, Vietnam, you name it. The French gave us money, their fleet, part of their army, uniforms, money, powder, guns. We even designed our first muskets made at Springfield Armory and Harper's Ferry after the French Charleville, not after the British Brown Bess. So we were hooked in with the French as being the laudable, notable, pronounced leader of military affairs in the world until 1871, when the French and the Prussians, with Germany's wrestling around to establish a nation-state status that it never had. When the French were defeated by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, then the French bubble of military influence was popped with the Prussian bayonet. And then we, as an adolescent nation, not sure who to follow, we traipsed along then following the Prussians and the English. And we did that until the end of World War I. Then we were the big dog, because those nations had destroyed such a generation. They had exhausted their treasure. It was not as ruinous in terms of the landscape as World War II was to Europe, but we were the top dog from that point on, and we're still riding in that saddle and stirrups now. It began with the end of World War I. So this is a reflection of our being under the influence of the English and the Germans. It is an American helmet. If you look carefully, the eagle, E pluribus unum and whatnot. Now the Prussians had a leather helmet. This is pressed felt. And also, you'll be able to see this if you ever look at the officers' helmets. Theirs is made of cork with broadcloth covering. Their metallic furniture is gold or silver, atop very fine die-struck metal. This is just gold washed. The foot troops wore the spike. Anybody was a foot troop. Foot artillery, the post quartermaster, commissary, ordnance, infantry. The mounted services, including Signal Corps, wore plumed helmets. Signal Corps had orange. That was its color. Cavalry yellow. The officers who had the plumed helmets, oh, they were beautiful. Instead of having dyed horsehair for the enlisted man's cavalry helmet, they had dyed yak and buffalo hair. Instead of having just a German silver insignia, they had coin silver or sterling silver and whatnot. So you could see the caste, the social dimension of we're not quite a democracy yet, certainly not in military ranks. We're still that way, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So that's the story of the helmet, what it has to say. For those of you who just joined us, we're sitting right by the gravestone of a man who was the post ordnance sergeant at Fort Missoula between 1892 and 1902. He actually had been here in the infantry when he was serving in the infantry, and you had to do that. First, let me tell you how important post NCOs were. Have you ever gone over to this log building over by the brick building that is the Historical Museum of Fort Missoula? Could go there sometime, and in addition to going into the former museum in the 1909 brick quartermaster warehouse, look to your left or to the east of the brick museum, and you will see a log structure. It is what we would call today a duplex. Back then they called it a double set of quarters, and it was for the post non-commissioned officers at Fort Missoula. In that building were the post commissary sergeant, the post quartermaster sergeant, and or the post ordnance sergeant, with or without family and dependents. Those men were the stud ducks of the garrison. They were post property. They didn't, when a regiment came in, the 7th and the 3rd and the 25th, when they left, these folks didn't leave. They were responsible, post commissary, as you'd guess, foodstuff. Post quartermaster, paint, nails, horses, straw, glass, you name it. They were the Home Depot mid-level executives. Post non-commissioned officer for post ordnance was taking care of firearms, powder, any of the ordnance and ordnance stores that would be required not to just go out willy-nilly, because a lot of soldiers were looking for the first opportunity to be able to, as they called it in those days, shove up, which means to sell to a civilian some item of value, especially if that money was going to accrue to you to help fund your desertion. And you know, the American Army in the frontier West between the 1866 and 1890 suffered a 1/3 desertion rate. It wasn't because they were cowards. It was just that when a lot of them, they all joined for so many reasons. Run away from a third wife, get away from being an Illinois farm plow jockey for the family. I'm tired of being a 50-cent a week grocery clerk in Wisconsin. Dad did this in the Civil War. Uncle did this. I want to see what that was like. I want to continue in the family tradition. There was just a myriad, a plethora of reasons of why young men joined the military. But one of the main reasons was, if you join in the military, and you're usually going to be sent west, if you were lucky and you joined the Coast Artillery or the heavy artillery, which was called the branch of the women and the wine, because you had these huge coastal fortifications from Maine down to Florida, and they were all by these wonderful cities were sophisticated with nightlife and all of the other social attractions. But if you were sent west, you are going to be getting free transportation, you're going to be getting shelter and food, and then at the first opportunity, you'd be able to go off to the mines, or go to work for the railroad, or go to some other thing. So some individuals had in their mind already that they were going to be deserting. And it wasn't looked at with the degree of pejorative interpretation that we have today. You've probably read that occasionally when a regular or a reserve individual refuses to go back to Iraq and is then accused of being a deserter and will have to suffer the consequences, that has a lot of steel hammer to it. But in these days, the Secretary of War said that, good, let them desert. It'll build up the West. They just accepted it as a matter of due course. Okay? Well, Pillow didn't intend to do that. He was probably like a lot of Afro-Americans who saw an opportunity to elevate themselves out of the racism and the deprivation and the residual slavery of a new form that the South was after the Civil War. It wasn't over. It just took on a new mantle of clothing. It takes a long time for habits to die. You know, patterns of behavior perpetuate long after situations have changed. You can see that in human behavior today. So Pillow joined probably at age 16 to get out from Murray County, Tennessee. So he had a mother and father with last names, but we don't know whether he was a slave or whether, as a child, or whether he was a child born into free men of color. So anyway, 1870 he joins, and he's placed with Company G of the 25th Infantry. Now you may know that at the end of the Civil War, the government saw, the War Department and our society saw that, yes, Afro-Americans will indeed, how many of you saw Glory, 54th Massachusetts? Okay. Montana, by the way, has a connection to that. You know what the military post that is between here and Great Falls on the Sun River is named? Fort Shaw. Named after the young colonel of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry who was killed leading the 54th Massachusetts in front of Battery Wagner, Fort Wagner, Charleston Harbor. The Congress authorized the outfitting and the paying and the equipping of 6 regiments of soldiers, about 1,000 each, to help in the push west. Because we've gotten through with the business of keeping ourselves from blowing apart north and south. Now it's time to go back to our real occupation, and that was moving west. It's a state of mind, not just a compass direction. And so here they went to provide soldiers who, soldiers in the Civil War for the most part, did not want to re-enlist. They'd had enough of seeing the elephant. They'd had enough during that brutal period of time. Native Americans hearing about soldiers in the Civil War could not believe that you willingly participated in your self-destruction by lining up next to one another within an easy musket range. To a Native American, you became no dull knife, little wolf, crazy horse. If you looked at the stars, you obtained your medicine, you obtained recruits of the other young men to go out and steal horses or raid a camp or whatever. If you came back and you lost one or two, you were a pariah. You didn't get a silver star. There was no accolade from the wings of your society, because Native Americans, if they lost somebody, it took 16 years to replace that warrior. Whereas in the Army, you could go down to the end of a dock and get an immigrant in 2 weeks. So they couldn't understand this complete wanton destruction of human life. Well, Pillow will join one of the, Congress authorized 6 regiments, but they eventually only funded 4. Congress went on a big, as you'd understand, after 4 years of paying for the Civil War, they just lowered the cost of the Army. Everything. In fact, in 1876, they didn't even vote for the officers and the enlisted men pay. And everything of the old pattern, Civil War pattern, had to be issued before any new items went in. Congress was on an economy leap that lasted for a long time. So they only funded 4 regiments. The last of the 25 regiments of infantry, 24th, 25th, the last 2 of the cavalry regiments, 9th and 10th, and Alexander Pillow, as a young man, goes out and is placed in Company G of the 25th Infantry, and they're sent to Texas, Fort Clark, Fort Concho, Fort Bliss. That was an appropriate place for Afro-Americans to be sent. And that lasted till 1882, when they sent the regiment up to the Dakotas, which in the summertime can be kind of like Texas, but not in the wintertime. Well, Pillow will be in his tour with the 25th. He'll eventually achieve, when you were released from the Army, and a lot of people joined the Army not just to desert, not just to have shelter as Afro-Americans look for. Boy, they had folks, I wish I could have brought over some photographs that show some of the Afro-Americans who were here with the 25th Infantry from 1885 till 1898. These are studio photographs. and the way these men carrying themselves, the way their eyes look at you. No more of this, yes, sir, boss. I'll step off. I love to wash your clothes. I love to fry your chicken. I'll step to the side of the sidewalk. None of that stuff. It wasn't malevolence. It wasn't an intent for payback. It was now an image of self-confidence that finally we have this in the Army that we're not getting in many other places in our society. So Pillow joined the 25th Infantry, sent to Texas. He was there as a sergeant. When you received your release from the Army, you had, if you wanted to stay with it, you had to enlist the very next day. Otherwise, if you were sergeant, you'd have to start all over again at the bottom. Even if it was only 1 hour after 8 o'clock, you would have to start all over again. So Pillow realized his coming when his first occupation, farmer, he was now in every other enlistment as he went up the line, soldier, 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 soldier. He found his life's calling. And when they released you, they would give you a certificate where they would describe you physically and when you enlisted in whose company, and then it would show what engagements you were in. And then would also then have at the bottom, about a third way down, had a horizontal line, and it said in bold letters, character. And then there were 2 blank lines that would be signed by the colonel of the regiment and your company commander. And the typical entries of the time would be, in effect, a character appraisal. And it would say, intemperate but an industrious worker. Meaning he drank, but he was a working alcoholic. Or an excellent man in all respects. No restriction to his reenlistment is recorded. Or it might just say excellent. Pillow got very good and good. So something was going on there where he wasn't getting A at the class, but he wasn't getting D's either. For some reason they used to have you can go up and down the pole. He's a sergeant and then he becomes a private. Teamster, he's driving wagons around, mule wagons. Then he goes up to corporal, supervising men in Texas building a road. And then he's back up to where he is a guard. And then the regiment goes to Dakota. He goes back up to where he's a corporal. He gets to Missoula in 1885, and he becomes a sergeant again. And now his star is ascending. Let me give you a feeling about his reputation as he began to get through those genetic and chemical problems of being young. Do you remember all that stuff, folks? He began to get his gyroscope and his sextant in order. He became a marksman. You know what our name of our school over here at the side of South Avenue is? Target Range. Because there was a 1,000-yard range from about there clear up to the gravel spur. That is very little of it left now. It used to be back in the 50s or 60s, you could see all the dishes from where the butts were, from where all of the target frames were, and the dishing and gouging. I suppose you'll still find some residual amount of lead back up there if you ask permission from the target range folks to see if you can find something in the interest of the interest of national defense, saving history, and go back there and get a few bullets if you can. Well, that's where the impact was, because the infantry companies are here. This wasn't a cavalry post, it was all infantry. Those men who had seen the disasters at Little Bighorn, at the Big Hole, at Canyon Creek, at the various other places where the Army's escutcheon was being tarnished, what is it about the inability of us to defeat Native Americans? Well, they were just using firearms that had been used for hunting and for their own activities as warriors, and they were turning them against those that were oppressing their attempt to maintain their life. Whereas Americans, we do not have some genetic capability to be the complete marksman. You need to be trained with good equipment and practice, practice, practice. Before the middle of the 1870s, you know how many cartridges you received per year to practice, to qualify? 10. One of those congressional parsimonious moves. We're not going to waste that stuff on those guys. Eventually they got around it by 1881. The cartridges that you and I know of today with the reloadable primers, those started coming in. And every little box of Frankfurt Arsenal ammunition, you will notice, has a little description that says, soon after firing, the cases must be plunged in water. And then it talks about sizing and oiling and decapping and whatnot. When they fired out here, they were using reloaded cases. That post non-commissioned officer, Ordnance Sergeant Pillow, and the other men who were in his branch would issue kits to the men to, under supervision, take out the primer, resize, oil, put in the bullet, put in the powder, etc. So that was a very important thing. They gave extra pay. If you achieved a marksman and sharpshooter rank, they gave you a collar and then breast medals to show all of your prowess as a marksman. Folks, this went on to a degree of where medals that were struck and designed by some of the top medalists at the U.S. Mint were made for awards to the U.S. Army at district, division, departmental, and Army-wide. It's quite a story. In fact, here at Fort Missoula, if you ever go over to the Powder Magazine at the corner, southwest corner of the post, that stone building that's painted white, that's the Powder Magazine. Sergeant Pillow had charge of that. That's where everything was kept in. Targets, target frames, glue, pasters, extra firearms in the trunks, ammunition, etc. When you open up the door, and it's the original door, and you look at the backside with its zinc, non-sparking backing, it has the name of the next ordnance sergeant who replaced him, Horace Bivens, another Afro-American, and it has the serial number of his rifle. No marksman wants any other individual to mess around with your rifle. Don't want to have the sights fiddled with. Leave it alone. It's pencil scrolled, still there. Amazing. Now, because he was to retire from service from the line branches, he was still in service as a post non-commissioned officer service quarters, but he didn't get involved in the American experimentation with imperialism, fiddling around with colonies. That, as you well know, ill-befitted a nation that based its origins on kicking off those odious traces. But Pillow was very disappointed that he couldn't go on the bicycle infantry experiment. He saw it go out of here. He participated in going up to Demersville to put down a little altercation with Native Americans. He was involved with the appearance of the American infantry going out to stop Coxey's army in 1894, a really important event in American history, because the Coxey's army during the Depression of 1892, 93, 94, that really hit hard in the West. The mines of silver, the forests in the Pacific Northwest, everybody was out of a job. This is when unions began to make more of their appearance, and the establishment was more worried about that revolutionary concept. The march of the Coxeyites. Jacob Coxey was a brigadier general in the Civil War Army. He was a quarry owner. He was a captain of industry, but he took pity on the private individual who was without a job. And so there was this organization, kind of loose in some areas, but very organized in other ways. As they were going to go across the Midwest, the farmers, who were also suffering from the effects of the Depression, were going to feed these guys. They went back. They were going to Washington, D.C. This was not American. You lifted yourself by your own bootstraps, even if you didn't own any boots. You didn't go back and ask Uncle Sam or Washington or the president or anybody do something for you. You did it yourself. Self-individualism, self-sufficiency, that stuff. That was the breaking down. Things became more complex economically. It wasn't possible to be Horatio Alger. You lose a job here, just go off in the wilderness and start your own. It's all in somebody else's safe deposit box with the paper and the control and the ownership of the resources. So he was involved with the 25th Infantry going up to Arlee to stop a train that had been shanghaied by folks from the Pacific Coast who were going to drive that thing all the way back to Washington. And so the soldiers were there trying to stop that. Now you can imagine, this is the 25th Infantry with Afro-Americans trying to stop Americans, mostly white, who were looking for a job, for economic alleviation. Probably some extra charcoal there in race relations. He also was involved in the Silver Strikes, having to go over the Silver Strikes in Idaho. You probably read about the goings on there in the Silver Valley. Bivens was involved in a number of things. For a long while, the American military, having kind of schizophrenia about what should be the weapon for the armed forces. The old school thoughts, the old mildewed medieval minds upstairs in the War Department and in the Colonel of Ordnance's staff felt that a single shot was the best weapon for a soldier. Because by the gods and the pink-toed prophets, if you had one cartridge, you were going to make that count. Whereas if you had a whole bunch, you'd be using it like a garden hose. Well, the psychology is exactly the opposite. If you have a whole magazine full, then you can afford not to get buck fever and not to get too frenzied by only having one cartridge, because you've got that reserve. But that tradition continued right into the 20th century. For those of you who know firearms, the Krag rifle has a cutoff. The 1903 Springfield has a cutoff. You fired it single shot until the orders of an officer would allow you to flip the cutoff and now have access to a magazine charge of ammunition. Okay? Well, the Army, while it was still looking at the virtues of the single shot and its simplistic, its simple mechanism, they looked down upon Billy Joe and Bubba as not being capable of taking care of too much sophisticated, cranky components of a firearm. They wanted it simple. And there's virtue to that. But every once in a while the Army would try field trial models because they were looking off to the side and they're saying, Franco-French and the Germans and the English, they're going multiple fire. They're going to magazine or bolt action. So we had some perfunctory experiments. This is the Model 18E Ford Chaffee Reese. Fires the same cartridge, single shot, but it's bolt action. It had cartridges going up the tube. There were only 750 of these made at Springfield Armory. And what they would do then is they would send these out to various posts, various climes, temperatures, soil conditions, to have it field experimented with by various units. This came to Fort Missoula, not this particular one, but one of exactly this pattern. This came to Missoula in the 1880s for field trials with the 25th Infantry. I'll bet you that he may not have had one issued to him, but Alexander Bivens, Alexander Pillow, certainly knew about the Chaffee Reese and took some interest in it. He might even have had charge of these after it was considered to be too persnickety and too intricate for the enlisted man to keep it in tune and not have problem with sand or rust or whatever. He might even have had charge of them before they were sent back to Springfield Armory and then placed back in storage for sale to South America or to National Guard outfits or whatever. So Pillow is hither and thither in many, many ways.
Welcome, thank you for coming today. This is Section C, Grave 62. As you notice, this is marked by a stub of a very small, non-standard issue marble stone. Originally, this stone stood about 10 inches tall. It did not have a name or a date on it, and it has been broken off over the years because of maintenance. But we believe that it is the grave site of Master Sergeant Bozo. Master Sergeant Bozo was born in the Missoula area. The exact date of his birth we don't know, and we don't know if he had any prior service in the military, but he did start his tour of duty here at Fort Missoula in 1928 with the 1st Battalion of the 4th U.S. Infantry Regiment. His rank at that time when he enlisted is not known, but by 1932 he had already been promoted to the rank of Master Sergeant. As a senior non-commissioned officer, his loyal service often exceeded the usual duties assigned to someone of his rank. Master Sergeant Bozo loved being in the military. He could be found at all hours of the day and night performing inspections of the fort property, and it is said for some reason, and we're not sure why, trash cans were of a particular interest to him. He would patrol on foot the living areas, the duty station, and the farthest reaches of the fort boundaries. He actually had to be restrained from excitedly greeting both formal and casual visitors to the fort. He loved people and he loved being in the military. Rank was no deterrent to him, although he really seemed to prefer the children who were living on the post. But he got along with everybody. He knew all the enlisted men and everyone knew him. He was familiar with the interior of every shop building, sentry post, and most of the offices. He most likely also had been invited into the private living quarters of everyone, and in some capacity or other, he supervised parade ground activities such as roll call, duty formations, drills, parades, flag raising and lowering ceremonies, and it is said that in his off time, Master Sergeant Bozo loved baseball. He loved it when they would do baseball games out here and he could participate in the baseball games. We don't know anything about his private life, however, and there's no record of any family. And if he spent any free time off the post, it's not been recorded. We don't know anything about that. However, his life ended on a tragic note. On October 23rd, 1940, Master Sergeant Bozo was struck and instantly killed by a civilian Conservation Corps truck near the Post Guard House, which is on the old dirt road over in the back of the fort where the golf course comes in now. This accident probably resulted, I would think, in some impromptu boxing matches between the 4th Infantry men and the members of the CCC. Maybe the guy who was driving the truck, we're not sure. But Sergeant Bozo's death ended 12 years of honorable service to this post and its garrison. He was accorded all the honors befitting his rank in military service when he was buried on the grounds of the post. People who were here said that he was buried in a place of honor. And what better place of honor do you have on a military post than in the military cemetery? Now, even today, there's a little bit of Master Sergeant Bozo left here at Fort Missoula. You can see his footprints in the step in the front of the old powder magazine, which is on the bank of the river. Over there on the other side of the buildings. You can still go over there, it's right along the river. And here is the powder magazine building. Here's the date, March 1934, when they put the step in. And here is Master Sergeant Bozo's footprint. As you can see, Master Sergeant Bozo was the mascot for the 4th Regiment here at the fort. And we actually have a picture of him. This is his obituary that ran in the Missoulian. And here is Master Sergeant Bozo.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you for coming. Do you have any questions for me?
Did he bury any bones on the fort's ground?
He buried so many bones on this fort ground. They're still digging them up today, yes.
Did he have a favorite hydrant? Okay.
Probably the hydrant that was attached to wherever the water wagon was.
Since he's buried
right here
in between the aisle, would that be another dog over there, do you think?
No. Am I still on? Yeah. Okay. Actually, that is called, and there's one right here below your camera, below your tripod. Those are called footstones, and they actually mark the end of someone's grave site. But you can see that these are much smaller, and these are level and flat. They're much smaller in size, and this was a bigger stone, and it has been knocked off.
And is there any relationship between people here and that?
Not that we know of. However, he is surrounded by children. There's children all over here, so we think maybe they buried him here with the children. And we're sticking to that story until someone comes and tells us differently. Thank you.
My name's Bob Brown, and I'm actually the director of the Historical Museum just down the road. So certainly, take advantage of the time to go down there as well. But I am portraying Major Charles Rawn, who, as Captain Rawn of the 7th Infantry in 1877, founded Fort Missoula. So I arrived here in June 25th, 1877, and one of the first things that I did was to plot this cemetery. And as such, can hold about 400 graves, more as people are buried together or cremations. Currently, I believe there are 251, so it is an active military site. Now, The grave that I'm beside, the person that I'm talking about, is Lieutenant Thomas Wallace. Now, Lieutenant Wallace is the very first officer to be permanently buried here at Fort Missoula. However, he is not the first officer buried here. First officer to be buried here was Captain William Logan. Now, Captain Logan was my second in command here at Fort Missoula when we built the fort. Now, we arrived, as I said, in June of 1877. The next month, we were ordered to stop the Nez Perce, who were being pursued by General Howard out of the Idaho Territory. We attempted to stop them at Lolo Canyon, and what passes for a newspaper in this community has decided to call this the affair at Fort Fizzle, and question whether or not I had obeyed my orders. General Terry, my superiors, told me I did everything I could, so if you must refer to that engagement, it's the affair at Lolo Canyon. So please, I greatly appreciate that. But following that, along with Colonel Gibbons' men, we pursued the Nez Perce and eventually fell upon them at the Battle of the Big Hole on August 9th and 10th. There, in hand-to-hand combat, Captain Logan managed to kill this Indian brave. But just as that's happening, the Indian brave's sister reaches over, grabs a pistol, turns, fires, and shoots Captain Logan right between the eyes, killing him instantly. Captain Logan was buried here at Fort Missoula, and we're not exactly sure where. It was only temporary because his family later had him disinterred and buried at his home site, back in Illinois, I believe. But Lieutenant Wallace, our first permanent officer inhabitant, was born in 1844. He was born in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, an Army brat, if you will. So it was preordained that eventually he would become a soldier. And he enlisted in May of 1865 in the volunteer New York 4th Artillery as a private. He never saw action during the Civil War, but since he was in uniform, he is technically a Civil War veteran. Now, after the Civil War, the 3rd Infantry, he was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the regular Army, 3rd Infantry. They did reconstruction duty in some of the southern states, helped bust a couple strikes up in the Midwest, and then frontier duty, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, fighting the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. Then in November of 1877, the 3rd Infantry replaced my 7th here at Fort Missoula, and would be here for 10 years and do most of the construction of the camp. But it was the summer of 1878 that some of the Nez Perce who had escaped capture at the Bear Paw Mountains and had escaped into Canada, they were coming back and they were going to rejoin going back to the reservation, if you will. Well, some of the renegades down in the Rock Creek area killed a couple of white settlers. So Lieutenant Wallace was ordered to take a patrol to about 15 men, including a couple scouts. Took all of the fort's horses, all 16 of them, and it's an infantry camp, but you got to have horses. Got to have horses. Pursued the Nez Perce. July 20th fell upon them at the middle fork of the Clearwater River out in Idaho Territory, and in a 2-hour battle managed to kill 6 Nez Perce, wound another 4, with no casualties to the Army. Well, the Army then returned to Fort Missoula, but the lieutenant unfortunately did not have that much longer to live. It was December 8th, 1878. The lieutenant, with 2 friends of his, the post doctor and a man by the name of Lieutenant Avery, decided to go out hunting that Sunday afternoon. They went out past O'Brien Canyon to Grass Valley. There, they got separated. The doctor and Lieutenant Avery arrived back at camp sometime that evening, fully expecting to either find or have the lieutenant join them. Lieutenant Wallace never showed up. When he didn't show up the next day, they sent out a search party. They sent out search parties for the next week. They finally found Lieutenant Wallace's body on December 15th, 1878. Evidence there at the site indicates that he was crossing the Missoula River, now the Clark Fork, and either fell off his horse or was thrown off his horse. He managed to swim to shore, but he was so cold and wet and tired that he died of exposure, hypothermia we'd call it today. So he was brought back to camp and buried right here on December 18th, 2 days short of his 34th birthday. And here he's continued to remain since then, our first officer to be permanently buried on site. The first soldier actually is a private, buried way over there, way over there.
And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Richard Zenk, who has been here now for 25 years. Buried here in 1982. This is an interesting story in Dan. He served in the military, active duty, for 27 years, and he also spent 6 years in the Montana National Guard while he was going to school here and while he was in high school in Glasgow. He grew up on a wheat ranch in Tampico. You know where Tampico is? It's just a little town outside of Glasgow on Highway 2. He didn't want any part of wheat farming. All of a sudden he became interested in the military, and he came over here and went to school in 1950, graduated in 1955 went through ROTC, was commissioned as second lieutenant, and became a regular Army officer in the infantry. And you can see here where he was also Ranger qualified and he was airborne qualified. Out of the 27 active duty years that he spent in the military, he served 10 of them overseas. He had 2 tours in Germany in the late 50s and later in the 60s. Remember, well, let's see, yeah, you probably remember this, that in that period, in the 50s and early 60s, the Cold War was going on. And we actually believed that the Russians were going to attack us at any time. Right. And there was a big fear in Germany. So we had hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany at that time. He also had 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 tour in Korea. So he had 10 years outside the United States, which is rather unusual. I served 30 years in the Army, and I only had 8 years outside. The nice thing about coming back to the States is getting assigned to the Pentagon. And he spent 2 tours in the Pentagon. And he had a journalism degree, and the Army found out about his journalism degree, and so they asked him to specialize in handling the reporters, handling the media. And that became the last 10 years of his career. That's what he did in the Pentagon, in Vietnam, and a little bit back in Germany, was handle the media. His wife found a mole on his back in early 1980s that was cancerous. He had melanoma. He was given 1.5 years to live. He said, I want to go back to Montana. I'd like to go back and die in my home state. And he did. And he asked his wife if he could be placed out here. And she did. And I knew Dan. I served with Dan in the Pentagon and in Germany. He was a highly qualified, dedicated officer. And it was a pleasure, or a real pleasure for me to know him, and an honor for me to serve with him. So that's a little bit about the story on stone of Dan Zenk.
Is his wife still living?
His wife's still living. In fact, she was here a little earlier. Well, thanks for coming by.
Well, thank you.
Well, I'm here to talk about General Frank Milburn. People have asked me today why General Milburn is buried here when he was born in Indiana in 1892, and the answer to that is when he retired from military service in 1952, he got the job as athletic director at the University of Montana. We don't know how long he held that job, but had a very interesting career. He graduated from West Point 1914 as a second lieutenant, and during World War I and the years after that up until World War II served in the Canal Zone and a number of different infantry regiments. By the time World War II started, he had attained the rank of colonel and was sent right after December 7th, 1941, sent to Command and General Staff School and received his brigadier rank, 1 star. From that point on, he commanded various divisions and Army Corps up until approximately 1945. Then he served as acting commander of the 7th Army in Germany. He got his 3rd star, Lieutenant General, in 1949. During the Korean War, he briefly commanded the U.S. First Corps. His career is remarkable in the sense that many general officers don't command 5 Army Corps during their career. As I said, he arrived here in Missoula in April 1952, hired on as athletic director. In December of that year, his wife died, and we kind of lost track of him after that. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that his career at the university was rather short, and then about 10 years later he died and was interred here. We think what happened was that when his wife died, that kind of changed his whole life and perspective. The website that we went to on the internet was an Army site, and it was really just strictly Army, and they didn't go into a lot of personal detail. So, but a remarkable man, was 70 when he died, and had a remarkable career. This is General Milburn, and that's his wife, and people have asked me why we have some in-ground plates and upstanding, and the answer to that is kind of depends on who's in charge of the VA at the time of a person's death. Our Western Montana State Veterans Cemetery, which will be completed next year, will have upright stones, as we see in the background here. And we decided to do that because it's much more dramatic and gives a much better appearance. There's no difference in the maintenance or the cost, and this means a lot more. Everybody I've talked to today feels that the upright stones are the way to go, so that's the decision we made.